All right, is it going? Okay, I made a presentation on this iPod because I had to. iPad, whatever. Okay, so fuck that. That's so I've been thinking about ITO. All right, and the thing is, it sort of implies that there's an input that goes into a thinking process, and then a thinking process produces an output. So, in terms of dealing with this more realistically and dynamically, I drew it this way. Let's draw the timeline down, an input event on the timeline, and an output event on the timeline. And then the way of thinking is, happening in between these two moments. Okay, the first thing I'm thinking about is that actually, of course, this output is called an output. And maybe, the thinking process, I mean, I would suppose, does create output that we don't, that just exists. But for us to think about it, we have to perceive that. So we have to recognize, we have to perceive ourselves doing an output. So, I knocked the glass on the floor. In order to think about what I've done, I have to notice that the glass fell onto the floor. So those outputs are inputs as well as far as the thinking process. But a bigger problem is that in a real-time process like this, of course, our thinking process on the scale we're talking about has a lot of, is interrupted. There's a lot of inputs and outputs. I said originally that I and O were sets, and no two input perceptions are going to come at the exact same moment. So really, it's a continuous process. So we break the thinking process down into partial thinking processes. Okay. So when I write, an I and a T and an O as if it's input and output, what I've really done is I've resorted these things from their actual spatial location, and I have put them, into something conceptually as an output. I don't really know that a given thing is a figment of my imagination or that it isn't. The distinction of before and after takes a new meaning here because I is supposed to be, and we'll find out that part of the analysis, if you listen, you'll find out rather that because I already found this out because it's my thinking process. But a big criteria comes into what is a valid way to sort I. What's a valid? We can have certain criteria, and we say, how will you know? We have to invent a criteria like a materially valid set of I versus a materially valid set of O. We could put material ramifications on if it makes sense to consider something an input when maybe it happened down there, and do we know that it's a product of a way of thinking? If you're watching something happen and late in the game you see something, you think it's still the thing you're watching, but maybe it's a figment of your imagination. Now the other issue is how small is this dt of n? You know, is there ever a moment where we're not getting input? Well, at some point there's a reaction time or a chemical reaction time, but that would be pretty small. That would make dt at one end like an infinitesimal part of a thought process, and to get the whole thought process t, you have to integrate over and sum them all up from the infinitesimal level. Since there's a continuous series of inputs and there's a pattern in the inputs and certain truncation points, we can choose to identify the thought process between these periods of time, between one batch of perceptions and another. And we can break that process up however we want, really. So we're going to end up with the mathematics of this that says, T is made of, three of n other ways of thinking with n other inputs and outputs, and we're actually going to assume that we can always break down a perception into sub-perceptions. We can always break a thought process down into smaller thought processes, and we're going to choose to get pieces that are human size, things like guilt, religious viewpoints, aggressive ways of thinking, and so on. And And it's going to work best when the analysis, the understanding of the way of thinking is not something that depends on the order of inputs. Like, snowboarding, it depends whether you see this first or think that first. Those kinds of thought processes are not likely to be well served by this ITO approach. What is likely to be well served are ways of thinking that have been considered over and over, for which we can characterize the input and the kind of output it produces. Also, we didn't want to give up, in my view, anybody that would use this system as a shared analysis system, you wouldn't want to give up your ability to think sequentially. You wouldn't want to give up this distinction between input and output. You can blur it. You can try to understand how it's confounded and how it might be interleaved. But you want to persist this because this is a chain back to more raw input. It's the kind of thing that comes from or helps a view that every idea you can possibly have has some sense and motor origin. So like a concept of God doesn't just come out of thin air. It comes as a result of some sense and motor process. I believe it's like a deification of the human intellect, just like Plato's forms are like deifications of human ideas, making these human abstractions sort of get deified. There's a sense and motor experience that leads to that. It could become perverted. A grain of truth, could turn into something terrible, but there has to be some sort of grain for the pearl, of belief to grow around. And so this chain shows us to go back to the sense and motor. When we were dealing with guilt, if you had guilt, the very first input you're going to see, you can figure out by induction, the very first input you're going to see is not going to be a feeling of guilt. It's going to be colors and sounds. Let's say you misplace that object and it's hanging there ready to fall on someone's foot, and you didn't even know that until later when you found out and you remembered, oh, I'm the one that put it there, and someone's toe got broken. Well, when you're first hearing about this thing you've done, all right, it's going to be sounds and sights that you're going to get. It's not going to be a feeling of guilt. Then you're going to get a twinkling of, a perception, a picture of you being there, involved with what's being described, ahead of time, setting the thing down, and then you're going to process that. And then later on, maybe even a couple more times, till you get to this guilt where you're like racked with guilt. Like, oh, what are we going to do? I realize, So there's a series of ways of thinking and inputs and outputs. It's always going to go back to a sort of neutral colors, sounds, textures, basic feelings, or non-neutral feelings like smells and things like this. The smells intellectually come back to neutral things when we realize that it's chemical information. So in principle, even things like smell, which are hard to separate compared to visual, there's negative visual impressions that come sort of negatively, but it's sort of easier to separate that than it is with something so intensely, directly emotional like smell. But even then, intellectually, it breaks down into even smaller facts that we have been input through science. We've gotten these extra little, an idea of these early inputs, very raw input, and it looks very neutral. And the way of thinking is the processing which produces the emotions and everything else out of it. All right, cheers.